session this afternoon is on the matter of human security, the right to employment, livelihood, and equality. And essentially, we'll be looking at the issue of food insecurity, threat to livelihoods, and looking at conditions or the recent experiences in Sri Lanka and how can Pakistan learn from the Sri Lankan experience. As I was looking at the title, I was left wondering whether there would be time and scope, maybe later on, to also discuss the matter of how can Pakistan learn from its own experiences. Because Pakistan, if you go through the list of blunders in Pakistan's 75-year history on matters related to the economy, matters related to food insecurity, which has been unfortunately growing in recent years, you do find a long lineup of blunders committed by Pakistan itself. I'm Farhan Bokhari, just for the record. I'm the moderator for this afternoon. We'll be shortly joined by Dr. Atif Mian, who deserves really no introduction, and I feel as a Pakistani very proud to be moderating a session with an eminent economist such as Dr. Atif Mian, giving our keynote address. He's online now, I've been told. By way of introduction, Dr. Atif Mian is the professor of economics, public policy and finance at Princeton University in the United States. He's also the director of a major center for public policy and finance at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. His work has focused on the connections between finance and the microeconomy. That's essentially the information I was given, but he's a man of many different talents as an economist. His book, very interesting title, House of Debt, with Amir Sufi, is considered a landmark in the field of economics. And he's the first person of Pakistani origin to rank among the top 25 young economists in the world. In 2014, the IMF identified Dr. Atif Mian as one of 25 young economists who the IMF expects to shape the world's thinking about the global economy in the future. Among the discussants, we have on my very left, visiting from Sri Lanka, Mr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu. He's the executive director of the Center for Policy Alternatives, a leading research and advocacy public policy center in Sri Lanka. He's also the winner of the inaugural Citizens Peace Prize and secretary of the task force on mechanisms for transnational or transitional justice, invited by President Obama to his high-level civil society dialogue. So he's a man of many talents. Next to him is Ms. Lianne Houben, who's the Deputy Ambassador of the Netherlands to Pakistan. Prior to her present position, she's had some very rich exposure to Pakistan in the past as well. And she's also served as the Deputy Ambassador in Tanzania and Sri Lanka, which is one of the central subjects of our discussion today. So comparing Pakistan with Sri Lanka, and certainly the expertise that she carries will be very relevant to this dialogue, this discussion. And then she's also worked in Africa, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Zambia, Ghana, and then, of course, in Russia as well, which is a long time ago, which is, according to some people these days, as increasingly looking like Africa, but that's another story. And then my dear friend, Dr. Kaiser Bengali, he's a mentor to many of us. One of the most honest and upright economists that at least I've had the pleasure of knowing in Pakistan. Someone who's been very consistent with his views over the years. So unlike many other people, no names named, Dr. Bengali carries the distinction of really sticking to his views on important public policy matters, irrespective of his position within or outside the government. He's also been an advisor to the government of Balochistan, which has given him a unique position, unique experience to look at the matter of public finances and really look at finance as it works in government right at the grassroots. So with those words of introduction, I'd like to invite Dr. Atif Mian to please give his keynote address. As I said, I feel very honored and proud to be introducing someone as eminent and as respectable as Dr. Atif Mian. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Atif Mian.
I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the topic of the session, which is food security. And let me just highlight sort of the core point I want to make about food security. Food, obviously, literally is a question of life and death. So few questions are as important as the question of food. But the main point I want to make is that when we think of food security, the core issue, the structural issue, if you will, is not food per se, but is very much linked to the issues which are the theme of this conference and issues which Asma Jahangir Sahiba fought for throughout his life, which are questions of democratic rights, questions of equality of opportunity, and questions of equal treatment and equal access to opportunities for all citizens of a country. That is really at the core of the problems that might then lead to issues of food security. And I'll try to explain why I'm making this particular statement at the get-go. When we talk about food, one important person historically is Thomas Malthus, who was an English economist in the late 18th century. And in 1798, he sort of became famous for postulating that going forward, humanity will constantly face this challenge of food crises because population tends to grow exponentially. And so they will always bump against this barrier that they will be short of food, which will then constrain human population, human growth going forward. Fortunately for us, humanity, Malthus proved to be wrong. And that, I think, is very important to keep in mind when we talk about food security. The basic fact of global food supply is that we have abundant food, we have abundant calories available given the demand that humanity faces. And it is for that reason that since that time, late 18th century onwards, human population has grown tremendously, and yet because of scientific advancement primarily, food productivity has outpaced the demand for food. And so we have almost always been in a time when there is abundant food available. Now, when you contrast that with the question of food security, we see in the headlines many people facing food shortages and so on. The obvious answer to why humanity tends to face food security issues is that it's not a problem of lack of availability of food, but it is a reflection of some deep dysfunction that the society has, that people at times face the question of food security. Now, one person linking this to democracy in particular, one person who became very famous for making this point was Amartya Sen. And he pointed out that when you look at extreme events such as famines, the one sort of ingredient that is critical to generate famines is a lack of democratic participation in the population. So he gave the example of Bengal famine. We then found out later in the famous Chinese famine during the Mao Great Leap Forward era, that when people don't have a voice, it is in those kind of circumstances that their demand for food, so to speak, does not reach the political centers of the day, and that can lead to extreme dysfunctions in the bureaucratic setup, in the markets, and so on, that there can be large swaths of people who are not supplied the food that they obviously need and deserve. So the question of bringing everyone's voice to the table is extremely important when we talk about solving the problem of food security. Otherwise, it can lead to these extreme events such as famines. When we look at the question of food security in the Pakistani context, the basic fact, again, is that unfortunately, Pakistan ranks as one of the most insecure countries in terms of food. It has some of the largest rates of malnutrition, stunted growth of children. So clearly, the question of food insecurity is a very serious one in Pakistan. What are the reasons for that? I think the basic reason is quite obvious to all who study this question, which is Pakistan, for various reasons, has gone on a trajectory where it has adopted an unequitable growth process, where the divisions are very extremely unequal of what this country produces. And one way to look at that is that even when you condition, obviously Pakistan is a poor country, but even when you condition on Pakistan's GDP per capita, that is to say, even when you compare Pakistan to other countries at similar rates of per capita income, even then, Pakistan remains an outlier in terms of this question of food security. So even when we compare ourselves to countries like India, like Bangladesh, like Sri Lanka, who have similar income per capita, give or take, Pakistan has a lot more people who are malnourished, a lot more children who have stunted growth, a lot much higher mortality of under 5 children, and so on. What is the reason for that? As I've already mentioned, it's because we have fundamentally adopted a growth process that does not give equal opportunity to all. The question of food insecurity, nobody willingly goes hungry, of course. If people had enough incomes to support their livelihood, of course they would buy the food. That food is available in the markets. It's available in the Pakistani market. It's certainly available in the global markets. So the reason people go hungry, the reason children go hungry is because they have not been given the income opportunities needed to sustain their livelihood. And that's a very fundamental problem that large swaths of Pakistani population face. And until and unless we level that playing field to at least some degree, we are not going to solve this issue. So again, I just want to highlight that the fundamental problem is not one of lack of food, it is one of equitable distribution of economic opportunities. Let me now, at the very end, come to the Sri Lankan recent experience, because that is also very much related to a very high risk that I think is underappreciated in the case of Pakistan, that Pakistan faces. And that is the fragility of the macroeconomy when it comes to exposure to potential liquidity crises. Just very recently, we all know Pakistan recently went into an IMF program, but it was just a hair length away from falling into exactly the same currency crisis that we saw Sri Lanka fall into. And if IMF had, for example, refused to go into this program with Pakistan, there was no external financing available for Pakistan to meet its import needs. And of course, the most important import need for Pakistan is oil and food, two essentials without which the wheels of the economy and society would have come to a stop, and Pakistan would have had a massive problem with shortage of food, medicine, and of course, energy. So just because we avoided the Sri Lanka kind of situation because IMF gave us a thumbs up, so to speak, we should not now rest thinking that this situation cannot rise again. It can very well arise, and it can arise very quickly. For example, if energy prices keep going up, we can go back to that sort of a situation. But certainly, even if energy prices remain more moderated, the path that Pakistan has chosen in terms of the economic trajectory. Think of the various boom and bust cycles, and I've spoken at length about these issues in the past. That economic cycle that Pakistan faces periodically is the result of very deliberate policy choices that have been made in the past. And one consequence of those choices is that instead of investing in boosting the productive capacity of its people, so think about the involvement of women in the economy, which Pakistan really lags behind, or think about the involvement of the productive side of the economy as opposed to this unproductive rent-seeking elite that dominate Pakistan's economic landscape. It is a result of those choices that have been at times very deliberately made in Pakistan that we continually face these mega risks of not meeting our import obligations because we are not productive enough to sell enough to the rest of the world to satisfy what are our import needs in terms of energy, food, and other necessities. So I just want to close on that hopefully important point that comes across, that Pakistan needs to change fundamentally in terms of the broader rights that we speak of. Those are very much connected to the trajectory that the economy faces, and it certainly is a very important, I would say, ingredient into the extreme inequality and the extreme insecurity when it comes to food that a large swath of our population faces. Let me again end by thanking the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Dr. Atif Mian, thank you very much for your very timely comments, very straight to the point. Now, we do have a Q&A session later on. My question is, could you stay online till the rest of the speakers have spoken, or should we open the forum to Q&A with you? I realize because we're already running late, there's a delay.
I'm available, so as you wish, I'm here.
Okay, so why don't we go ahead and have our presentations? Dr. Atif Mian is going to be online. I've got a couple of questions. He's really brought up some very powerful points which I think need to be discussed, debated. So without further ado, if I can request Dr. Saravanamuttu for his remarks, please, given that he's from Sri Lanka and carries the right expertise to speak on the subject.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Given that the topic is what Pakistan can learn from Sri Lanka in our not very happy situations, I'm reminded of the opening lines of Anna Karenina, where they talk about how unhappy families are unhappy in their own different ways. So in that respect, I leave it up to you to decide as to what you can learn from Sri Lanka's misfortune at the present moment. First and foremost, let me say, I entirely endorse what the keynote speaker said with regard to food insecurity, and certainly those are characteristics that can be seen in the Sri Lankan situation as well. But there are some things that are different. Well, very basically, at the present moment, food inflation is something like 95%. We have people who do not have the ability to have 3 square meals a day. We have nutrition levels which are plummeting to the worst in the world. We also have situations in which children are fainting in schools because they do not have enough to eat, and teachers are therefore trying to organize community kitchens in the school to be able to make sure that the children have 3 square meals a day. In addition to that, of course, we have the problems with regard to basic essential medical supplies for people who get ill. Now, this is a situation that Sri Lanka has never faced ever before. We always said that in Sri Lanka we would never starve, but I think we have to look again at that situation, because there are parts of the country where this is happening. Now, we went to a 30-year civil war, almost 30 years, and we had bad situations like this. But now it is the entire country that is facing this. And quite frankly, at the present moment, the popular struggle, the demonstrations in the street have subsided. But if the situation with regard to the shortages of food, shortages of medicine, if that is to continue, it is entirely possible that we could get an explosion of discontent from outside of Colombo. And it would be a spontaneous explosion of discontent, not on the basis of constitutional reform or return the money you have stolen or go home, never get involved in politics, but on the basic question of we can't live because we can't feed our children, you know. Now, when you look at how we came to this situation, one must say that the Rajapaksas, the family that has dominated Sri Lankan politics in the last 20 years, they didn't create the situation. They just made it one hell of a lot worse. And in particular, there is one decision that was taken by them that compounded the question of food insecurity, and that was the president decided that overnight we would move from chemical fertilizer in agriculture to organic fertilizer. Overnight he decided to do that. Now, we all know that the decision in itself is not a bad one, but to try to do it overnight is disastrous. That has had a severe impact on the food supply chain. We have two major crops of paddy, because rice is our staple food. We have the Maha crop and the Yala crop, and the Maha crop has been severely affected by this whole decision to move to organic fertilizer. The soil in the country is not used to it. We've been for years and years and years using chemical fertilizer. We have to do it maybe over 5 to 10 years or whatever, but the decision to do it overnight really devastated the food supply chain. So in that respect, there have been immediate man-made decisions that have compounded or exacerbated the level of crisis that we've had to face. The other point also is this, is that in the meantime, we have been getting humanitarian assistance. India has been particularly good in giving us something like $4 billion in this respect. So we have been trying to bridge the gap somewhat, but I think we need a proper plan. And the problem, I think, if I may err on the point of exaggeration perhaps, but nevertheless I think there's a truth in this, is that we as South Asians are not particularly good at planning. We are not particularly good at planning, and once we make the plans, to stick to those plans. In addition, in Sri Lanka, we have a system of government which is national government, provincial government, and then we have local government. Now, the two lower levels of government can obviously assist in terms of the distribution of food, but they do not exist. It is now entirely a central government number. You know, it's entirely a central government function, and as a consequence, we may not be getting to those who really do need it. For years, Sri Lanka has had what we call a social welfare scheme. It used to be called Janasavya, now it's called Samurdhi. But we know that the lowest 25 percentile of the people who are eligible to get that benefit do not get it. And the reason for it is that there is political interference, and the benefits go to political supporters. That has got to change, and that's why I endorse entirely what the previous speaker was saying, is that it is not just a question of the availability of the food or the availability of the resources. It is how they are handled in terms of the management of it, the distribution of it. Now the IMF, in our conversations with the IMF has agreed, and it's not the IMF of yore, that was that terrible ogre who was wanting to privatize everything and all of that. The IMF has agreed that there should be cash transfers to the poor, that we should, as part of that package, have a proper welfare net, and that should be closely monitored to ensure that those who are in need of it do actually get it. So in terms of the food insecurity question, Sri Lanka, there's one other point that I need to make with regard to it. In terms of the Rajapaksas' complicity in making this worse, was that they stubbornly refused to go to the IMF, and as a consequence, they used our foreign exchange reserve to pay back international creditors. As a consequence, we didn't have a single dollar to import basic essentials. We didn't have a single dollar to import basic essentials, including, most importantly, food as well. So the situation in Sri Lanka at the present moment is one in which years of mismanagement, of drawbacks, and all of that have now been brought to a climax or a crescendo. And we really need to, as I said earlier today, we really need to redefine the social contract. We really need to ensure that the rights of people are heard, that they are not marginalized, that they're all included in this social contract. And then I think we will be able to get out of a situation in which we now have a country that had some of the best social development indices, now being one of the countries in which malnutrition is one of the highest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Our next speaker, Ms. Lianne Houben, Deputy Ambassador of the Netherlands to Pakistan.
Well, Dr. Saravanamuttu, we worked together while I was in Sri Lanka. I was in Sri Lanka from 2013 till 2016. Amazing country, fantastic, and it really hurts me to hear what you're saying. Of course, I read the newspapers, I watch what is on TV, but hearing it, coming it from you so clearly, it's really very painful. And even though I'm an outsider, I mean, I have part of my heart in Sri Lanka, and I took part of Sri Lanka with me. Same goes for Pakistan. I also lived here from 1997 till 2000. And I worked as a consultant at the time. Actually, I worked in tanneries and in environmental work. And I moved back to Pakistan 1 year ago. I have another 2 years in this beautiful country. And it is my sincere hope and wish that Pakistan will not go the same way as Sri Lanka, and that we all learn from what has happened. What you also were saying, the malnutrition and the stunting, what also struck me was Sri Lanka has one of the highest literacy rates in Southeast Asia. I remember everybody was reading books, everybody spoke perfect English. Schooling is incredibly important in Sri Lanka for both boys and girls. And one of the first things I read when the country defaulted was that there was no more money to buy paper for exams. And now, can you imagine the effect this has on generations to come if this situation is not changed quickly? And I'm not an economist, but when you look at some basic facts, you can see that there are a couple of things that Pakistan and Sri Lanka have in common, which is inflation, very high inflation, currency devaluation, very high external debt. Also, when you look at one of the highest provider of loans, China. Political instability, also political dynasties that you can also have you see a comparison. And both countries suffer from the effects of climate change, which was very visible in the floods which took place earlier this year. And also Sri Lanka has suffered and is suffering from the effects of climate change. Of course, one of the things that made income generation for Sri Lanka difficult was the occurrence of COVID. Sri Lanka is such a wonderful, beautiful country and thrives for, I don't know how many percent, but you will know that, on tourism. I think almost everybody knows one of two people who have went to Sri Lanka. One of the speakers told me that she went on honeymoon to Sri Lanka. Many people do that when they get married. And also the first time that I lived in Pakistan in '97, I went on vacation to Sri Lanka. Destination weddings as well. Did you get married there, Doctor? No? Talking slightly also about food security. The Netherlands is a very small country. It's 19 times smaller than Pakistan. And if you allow me to boast a little bit, we have the highest agricultural export in value in the world. So it was $100 billion last year. It's horticultural products, it's dairy, it's meat, it's eggs. And we didn't get there from one day to the other. It took planning, a lot of planning, and innovating, and technical expertise, how to make the best use of the very scarce land that we had. And yes, we make a lot of money by exporting. That is how the Netherlands makes money. And yes, we can feed a population. Of course, now we are also struggling now with the gigantic energy prices because of the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. But there is still food, and I cannot imagine that there will be a day that there will not be enough food. But it's also about distribution, and it is about ensuring that there is as little wastage as possible, and that includes planning. And that's also something that I think Pakistan could really learn from, because you have so much land, so much fertile land, and if that could be used also to export, apart from, of course, feeding the own population, that would be something that might be good looking into. We are very good in producing hybrid seeds. That those seeds produce extreme good products in vegetables. Yes, vegetables was one of the export products as well. So that is something that we work with many countries. We work with Pakistan in dairy. We have a big Dutch company active here, Friesland Campina, working with Engro. Just heard my neighbor is on the board of Engro, so there's also a connection here. And we are also looking forward to see how we can help Pakistan with the aftermath of the floods, because, well, more than 60% of the country is below sea level. So we have to struggle with the water to keep our feet dry. We are looking into cooperation with organizations, companies, to see what we can do in agriculture and in working with the flooding. We have companies with experts who are expert in dealing with flooding and avoiding next flooding. Look at Katrina. And we are actively working also with the government on that. I'd like to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. May I now request Dr. Kaiser Bengali to please share his thoughts with us. Thank you.
I had some points written down, mostly technical. but I think from Atif Mia's presentation and from what has been said here, rightly so, the question of food security is a political problem. It is not an economic problem. There are two aspects to food security: availability and affordability. Both are politically determined. Since we have the Deputy Ambassador of the Netherlands here, correct me if I'm wrong, but my reading of European history, in the last 100 years especially, is that Europe also suffered problems of inequality and poverty and lack of housing, but it was the emergence of the Soviet Union which changed that. Fear of communism induced change. It is 1917 when the Soviet Union was formed, and 1920 the ILO was formed, International Labour Organization. Suddenly labor had to be appeased. Something had to be done about labor if the rest of Europe wasn't going to go communist. Whatever the reason, it has been good for the people of Europe. And you have a welfare state, you have high standards, you have the rule of law. I've had chance to go to Holland, and a number of houses that I went, I found that the washroom was under the staircase. So you could only stand in one part of the washroom to take a shower. You couldn't go to the other part because it was too low. And I always asked, why is this so? And I was told that maybe 100 or 150 years ago, having washrooms in the house was not the norm. Okay? So something happened politically to change that. That has not happened in Pakistan. The state, and I'm not referring to governments, the state represents the elite and it serves the elite. It is not there to serve the people. Issues of food insecurity may concern us here, may concern the Asma Jahangir Foundation to have a session. It does not concern the government. And I've had bits and pieces of occasion being in and out of government, so I know. In 2008, the government of Sindh initiated a project. 2 billion rupees were allocated to give milk and biscuit packets to children in schools, government schools. And they asked World Food Program to execute that. 2009, I happened to be in World Food Program. So 2008, I was in the federal government. I had the occasion to design Benazir Income Support Program. Then 2009, I was in WFP. And 2010, I was advisor for planning and development in Sindh. So that project came on my table for execution. And I asked questions from the secretary, relevant secretary, how is this going to be distributed? How will biscuits and milk reach the schools? There were 49,400 government schools spread all over Sindh. 85% were one-room schools. Will this be sent every day? It's not possible. And if you are going to send it weekly or monthly, it will spoil. The milk will spoil. 40 degrees temperature, the rats will eat the biscuits away. They had no idea. They hadn't thought through that. There was no answer. And I cancelled that project. It came in the newspapers that I have deprived children of biscuits and milk, but I saved 2 billion rupees of government money because they wouldn't have got it anyway. But this is an example that a state wasn't really bothered. 2 billion rupees for milk and biscuits to children made good headlines, and they were going to go ahead with it. I can go on a lot. You mentioned hunger. Pakistan is not that short of food. our wheat deficit is about 2 to 3 million. We don't produce any dal or hardly any, and we import, and we don't have foreign exchange. So I think what I would say is the first responsibility of the government, of the state, is to provide food. It is the responsibility of the state. It is not the responsibility of the market. I think this is something that has to be understood. We must designate areas and acreage for wheat and dal and other essential commodities. We must not depend on import for these things because the international market is very volatile. Prices go up and down. It feeds inflation as it is doing now. If we were self-sufficient in wheat, we wouldn't have to face the effects of the war in Ukraine. So I think the basic problem is that the state has to be pro-people. State has to function for the people, which it is not. A lot of our acreage is devoted to sugar cane, which is not needed at all, and which only feeds certain political families. And sugar cane gets subsidy from the state in public money at two levels. First, we subsidize the farmers, and then we subsidize the sugar mills out of public money. And this public money is given to them, and we create a budget deficit, which then creates its own series of problems. There was you mentioned children are fainting in school. I've come across children who come to school and can't concentrate because they haven't had breakfast. They haven't had breakfast because their parents can't afford to give them breakfast. They just wake them up and rush them to school. How do you expect them to concentrate and learn? And government policy, lastly, I want to say, does affect availability. Affordability is a function of poverty and inequality and so on and so forth. The government has not cared about creating jobs. In fact, government policies have consistently killed jobs in this country. We have created a casino economy where wealth is created in the stock market and the property market through speculation. Factories are closing down, jobs are disappearing, and exports are disappearing. In November, we have to open the LC for import of wheat because our own wheat runs out somewhere in January. Then we are dependent on imported wheat. There was a time when after in the 90s, we had a 3-month caretaker government, and the advisor was imported from abroad, Pakistani, but came from abroad. His interest was to make sure that his record is good when he leaves after 3 months. He wanted to make sure that the foreign exchange reserves is more at the time of his departure than what it was at the time he took over. He did not open the LC in November. As a result of which, if you open the LC, letter of credit means that you place the import order, the ships arrive in January with wheat, and then it begins to get into the system. Because it was not opened in November, there was no ship arriving in January, and we had massive riots all across the country because there was no wheat. So availability is not just a macro variable that, okay, the country needs 30 million tons of wheat and we have 30 millions of wheat, but you can create shortages by these short-term problems. Then in a later government, I think about 10-15 years ago, data was manipulated to show that we have a wheat surplus, and the government exported wheat. And it turned out, no, it's not a surplus, it's a deficit, and we had to import wheat. So availability can be, we can have all the wheat available, we can have silos and warehouses full of wheat. That doesn't mean it is reaching everywhere, and Balochistan is one area where wheat does not reach. I have come across areas in Balochistan, there was just no wheat available anywhere, and there was one local flour mill वो क्या कहते हैं हम चक्की, you know, yeah, where there was wheat bags and there was cactus. And I asked them, what is cactus doing here? He said, we don't have enough wheat. People cannot afford wheat at this price, so we mix it with cactus powder so that the price can come down and people can afford it. I think these are some very down-to-earth issues of food security when we look at big numbers and concepts, and these get hidden out and don't get exposed. So I think people suffer when you don't pay particular attention to their needs, and they will never get attention unless and until the state is organized to address the people's needs and their needs, and not the needs of the elite. They don't, as it is in Pakistan now. The problems we face is not because of poverty. Pakistan is a rich country, resource-rich country in every respect. It is just the inequality and the maldistribution of resources, and those who make policy are insensitive to the people's needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those very insightful presentations. I'd now like to open the floor for questions. Before I do that, I have a question to begin with from Dr. Atif Mian. I'm going to use my position as the moderator to be the first to ask this question. You said towards the end of your presentation that Pakistan needs to change fundamentally, and you're obviously right in pointing out some of the major gaps: women, rent-seeking elite, and there are other gaps as well. Now, following the devastation caused by floods this year, there are many people who believe that Pakistan has now, 75 years after its creation, has come to a point following this major disaster, major calamity, that Pakistan will be forced to change. But this is still a matter under debate, because there are other people who say that the status quo, the forces that benefit from the status quo, are much too powerful, and that after the passage of time, it will be back to status quo. I'd just like to have to hear your expert opinion on this, since you're obviously considered a very well-respected authority on the subject.
Well, first of all, you're absolutely correct. The pressures in terms of forcing change are very much going to heighten, not just as a result of the floods, but as a result of sort of this unsustainable macro trajectory that Pakistan has been on. As your demand keeps rising, but your productive capacity is not rising at the same rate, obviously the screws are tightening further and further. So for both those reasons, yes, there is going to be more pressure to force change. And as Bengali Sahab mentioned, in the case of Europe, they also face their own pressures. Maybe it was, industrialization and the demand for labor combined with the rise of communism and things like that. It forced change, and political historians have very much talked about that. So I think you're absolutely correct. There is going to be more and more pressure for change, and you're actually seeing it on the streets now. It's not a question of hypothesizing about the future. So-called kind of holy cows are now very much dragged through the mud on the streets of Lahore and Islamabad, something that did not happen. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think the heat is going to be sort of faced at a higher frequency now. What I do not know, and you have a lot more knowledgeable people on stage and in the audience here, I'm sure. What I'm not convinced of is whether it will necessarily force change of the kind that we all agree we need. And the reason I say that is because while we do have the case of Europe, for example, doing the transition, and some other places as well, at the same time, we also have other scenarios. And what my real worry is that Pakistan kind of becomes a Haiti of sorts, a country that does not, continues to go on this trajectory and just sort of relies on exporting its people and living off the wages of whatever people can send back. that is an alternative. It will be it will ghettoize Pakistan, a country that everyone else, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, I'm sure will rise because they have very good fundamentals. But I'm not so sure about Pakistan. That's why I keep saying I think the people in power, the establishment or whatever, I don't think they really understand the scale of the problems they're grappling with. And if they truly cared about Pakistan's long run, they would be behaving very differently. But I do not see that, unfortunately.
Thank you, Dr. Mian. Before the questions, I'd just like to add a personal account very briefly. I was recently out in the flood regions, South Punjab in particular. And I came across, and this is in response to someone's question who asked me what was the worst sight that I saw as I went to different areas. And you know what? The worst sight was witnessing 3 little children in a tent, sitting inside there along with a dog. This is very unusual in the Pakistani context. And I asked their father, who was standing outside, I said, this is fine. I mean, I love dogs, but it's quite unusual. He told me that given that the government and the state do not exist, he doesn't get his protection from anywhere else. At least the dog there is going to remain loyal to the family. This is how desperate the situation has become, about 5 to 6 hours driving distance from Lahore. I'm just sharing this with you. I've shared this with many other people because there's a stark contrast between what you might see in the mall Lahore as opposed to the reality on the ground.
जी मेरा नाम कश्फ है. मैं यहाँ पे एक छोटा सा फर्म है लाइफ एट लाहौर वो चलाता हूँ. तो सर मेरा सवाल डॉक्टर आतिफ और सर आपसे कि आपके तो मैं कॉलम भी पढ़ता हूँ, तो लगता है तो वैसे कि आप एक तो लिखता इतने खूबसूरत हैं कि लगता है कि पाकिस्तान के मसले हल हो जाएंगे, लेकिन साथ में हमें ये भी लगता है कि बिल्कुल हो भी जाएंगे और इतनी बड़ी कोई रॉकेट साइंस नहीं है. और हम साथ में ये भी देखते हैं कि हमारी जो पॉलिटिकल लीड है वो इसके हल के लिए तैयार भी नहीं है. तो सर क्या आपको लगता है कि ये जो हमारे मसले का हल है ये सोशल एक्टिविज़म है, और जिस तरह हमने देखा है कि फ्रांस में और जो उनसे हमने और मुल्कों में भी देखा है कि लोग निकले हैं और ये इसका हल निकला, तो क्या आपको लगता है कि इसका हल सिर्फ और सिर्फ जो उनसा सोशल रेवोल्यूशन है?
My name is Farooq Tariq and I'm General Secretary of Pakistan Kisan Rabta Committee, a network of different peasant organizations across Pakistan. Now I would like to contribute in short terms about food insecurity. The issue of food insecurity, it's just 1 minute. Food insecurity was always an issue, but 2 things has aggravated at present time. One is this Ukrainian war, which has disrupted the supplies of wheat and fertilizer, and second is the flood in Pakistan at present time. And I think our speakers has not given much attention to the losses the Pakistani economy and agriculture. According to one estimate, is 0.4 to $18 billion loss to Pakistani agriculture due to this flood. 4.4 million acres of land has been destroyed because of this floods. So the attention on this issue of food insecurity is very much linked to these 2 incidents. And secondly, we use the term food sovereignty, not food security, because food security is very limited term, and food sovereignty brings together the rural poor, the landless peasantry, the Haris, the Mazaras, all who are living in the villages as part of the team rather than just those who own some land. And I would end on this, that feudalism in Pakistan is one of the major hindrances in providing the food to all citizens in Pakistan. Thank you.
Sir. Thank you.
So the question about activism, first of all, I think I'll just, there are different kinds of activisms, of course, but I think it's extremely important. In fact, that's what I started off with, that it's extremely important that the voice of the unadulterated voice of the people reaches the rest of the society, right? I gave the example of, how that is, that prevents famines and things like that. But in general, it's important to promote freedom of expression in a society for various reasons, so that a lot of times bad mistakes can be avoided. In fact, the case of Sri Lanka that our friend so eloquently described, part of the problem was that there was this small elite making just absolutely crazy decisions, really. It was, I think they just themselves did not know what they were doing. And there was no one to tell them that you guys have no clothes. And so many times things like that happen because you don't open up the decision-making process. It's not democratic enough, if you will. But going back to bringing about change, I think one needs to continue to have these conversations. I do fundamentally believe that it is extremely important to remain peaceful, no matter how strongly you feel about how you are being persecuted and so on. It's extremely important that one remains civilized and peaceful, but at the same time, one must have tough conversations. That is the only way we can change. It's not, we are all a family at the end of the day, and so I think that has to be front and center. On the question of agriculture productivity, and I very much agree with the Deputy Ambassador from Netherlands that Pakistan needs to, if there's one country Pakistan really needs to learn from, it's Netherlands, because of the remarkable agriculture productivity that it has generated. There is so much more that can be done. And while I talked about equitable growth, the fastest way to go in that direction is to boost agriculture productivity, because naturally agriculture touches the highest percentage of the population. And we are really behind. And then technology actually has tremendous opportunities there, both in terms of water conservation, in terms of dealing with resilience to climate change, boosting productivity. There's just an incredible, exciting opportunity there, but it needs to be tapped into. It requires a coordinated response from the government as well as the private sector. But we need to start having those conversations, and they are nowhere on the table. We keep having these kind of soap operas. Even one is going on right now on the political side. But these real issues need to be brought front and center. And I think part of what the activists can do is to bring these issues to the front of the table, as opposed to our usual kind of talk show highlights that we keep going in cycles about.
The second question about the Ukraine war and floods, it's not that we are not aware of it, but this is a transient problem in some way. When the war will go away and the flood will recover, I think all of us have spoken of the larger issues that are involved in food security. Ukraine war and floods has created a very serious problem, particularly in Sindh. You see, when the harvest takes place, especially wheat, farmers, even landless farmers, they have a bit of the grain that is stored for the next few months. It lasts them at least 6 months or so. All that has been washed away. They don't have wheat for tomorrow. So it is a certain problem. But we are aware of it. I think all of us are aware of it, but we were somehow discussing this subject on a different plane. On the first question, I agree that we have to be peaceful, because if you pick up the gun, then the state will change the narrative completely. We heard in the previous session how the state is doing that in Balochistan. We know how the Indian Army is doing that in Kashmir. Some of the what they call terrorist activities in Kashmir are orchestrated by their security agencies so that they can induce a crackdown. We are doing similar things in Balochistan here. So if you move away from a peaceful path, you really change the conversation completely. Then it's a different issue. But there is complete stonewalling where the state is concerned. Nobody, and I've been in the federal government, in the Sindh government, and in Balochistan government, nobody listens to the voice from civil society or anywhere else. In fact, they have disdain for civil society. The government definition of NGOs is no good organization. That's how they refer to NGOs. When NGOs are saying something, they dismiss it out of hand. They say, these are rabble-rousers, we don't need to listen to them. We need to get on the streets. Social media is good, but Pakistan does not have that kind of connectivity that Western Europe, or I don't know about Sri Lanka, has. There are vast numbers of people who don't follow the debate on national issues through social media. They use social media, but they use social media more for entertainment. We have to get on the streets. And the state will only listen to us if we are on the streets. तो मेरा पैगाम आपको ये है, बगावत करो. बगावत अच्छी चीज़ है. Rebellion is a good thing. But rebellion does not mean throwing stones and bombs. You know, rebellion, I use the term rebellion in a more intellectual sense. Challenge everything, whatever is being said. But without that, we will not change our fate. We will continue to slither into the kind of morass that we have fallen into.
Peaceful rebellion. The gentleman in the front here, उन्होंने पहले हाथ raise किया.
Department which concealment effect, no education to the institution in the respect that the population has to be controlled, and so the insecurity has to be taken up. Second, my question is to the Netherlands investor. Is with regard to that, I have seen, I am a farmer, basically self-cultivated. I am running an organization, Kisan Bachao Tahreek Pakistan, or I am an advocate Supreme Court also. Whatever I have seen, whatever the Netherlands has practiced in dairy farming, they have done it. The model which we have there, they tried and they donated the Pakistan donations and the investment made in Pakistan in heavy investment. But it does not go to the roots of the people, and it was emerged that the now Pakistani farmer has no food, no milk for his own. Very material. The investment which has to be given should be in a small size. That should go to the small farmers and the middle farmers, so that should be improved.
Right. Thank you.
एक question, Bengali साहब से बड़ा important question है. But due to the high cost of production, or insecurity is going to be the food. Pakistan is a food sufficient country if it can grow. It is the policy. मैं बड़े इत्तेफाक कर रहा हूँ साहब से कि आपने जो कि in December we imported and when our crop is in field, then the offloaded the field, which is against the क्या कहते हैं government policy is a bad corners. If legislation could be made in this respect that the special areas should be given for the pulses, sugar cane, grain, and
population for Dr. Atif Mian, how big is that a problem? Too many babies, too many people having too many babies. And then the other questions to the panel here. Dr. Atif Mian, on population, please, if you have any thoughts on that.
Ji, very quickly, let me just say I don't think population by itself is a problem. I think people sometimes confuse the symptom for the disease. We certainly don't want anything close to the sort of the draconian policies that China had. It's a fundamental right, human right, to have children as many as they wish at some level. The problem is not population growth per se. The problem is that Pakistan never went through the demographic transition that almost every other country in the world has gone through. And in my view, the core problem is it's women's rights, basically. That's how it should be framed. I don't think the problem should be framed as a population issue. I think the problem needs to be framed as a women's rights issue. Pakistan mein jab tak women ki involvement into the labor force, as long as women are not given equal opportunity, as long as their rights at work are not equally protected, as long as they are not protected from harassment of various sorts, उस वक्त तक आप ये population का जो issue है इसको solve नहीं कर सकेंगे. And again, it's a very well documented fact. Why is Bangladesh's population a lot less than Pakistan's right now? At the time of separation, Bangladesh had a larger population than what was then West Pakistan. Now they have a significantly smaller population, and they are much richer, and so on. सवाल ये है कि what happened? Well, the reality is that Bangladesh did much better in women's rights, in girls' education. They did much better in participation of women in the economic affairs of the country. They all benefited. And as a side benefit, they got their population growth under control as well. So forget talking about population planning and things of that sort. Start talking about women's rights and you will solve all these problems.
Please, Dr. Kaiser Bengali.
Gee, I agree with Atif Mian on both counts. I think in a land-man ratio sense, Pakistan's population is still not, it's entering the critical stage. Our growth rate is high, but the population is not really a problem as yet, except in certain pockets, except maybe in central Punjab and in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. But the real problem is not through having population control centers or telling people not to have babies. If you have, I think Atif Mian talked about women's empowerment, very correct. You know, we were conducting a survey in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, 5 or 6 districts, Swat being one of them, and South Khyber Pakhtunkhwa also. And our enumerators were all women, because the questionnaire was being addressed to the women there. And it was about housing and housing conditions and so on and so forth. But the interesting thing, a large number of our enumerators came back and said that the mother-in-law always sits there ensuring that the daughters-in-law don't say anything which is not acceptable. And the few moments when she would go out, these women would tell our enumerators कि हमें गोली चाहिए, we want tablets. They said we are sick of having children, but they cannot tell their husbands or their mother-in-laws or their families that we don't want children anymore. And we came across families with 10, 12 children, each. So this empowerment of women is a major issue. And education is another issue, where this is now empirically available all over the world, where both parents are educated, number of children are less. And if women are working, they are even lower. So the population problem can be resolved through education, through bringing women into the labor force, and empowering women to be able to decide to have a say in how many children they are going to have. If they don't have a say, and in rural areas, we don't have a say, and in fact, things have regressed. There was, I think, women had more, they were more empowered 20, 30 years ago than they are now. The religiosity that has taken over the last 20, 30 years has actually pushed women back and disempowered them. And I think the route that, as Atif Mian very correctly said, that women's empowerment, and I would add education, is the way to controlling population. If you control population, you control other things as well.
Yeah, I think we just have time. The organizers have just alerted me, and we have time for one last. Oh yes, okay. Yeah,
Thank you. Dutch companies, when they want to invest in other countries, they do their homework. They take a lot of time to find out what is the market in the country and what are the challenges, and they plan a long time ahead. They usually look for a local partner, and that's also the case with Friesland Campina. They looked at Pakistan and they saw a huge population, low protein intake, cows that produced very little milk, and they had the expertise and thought, well, let's take the plunge, let's take this gamble and invest in Pakistan. And they did, and they brought cows and semen and did a lot of training with farmers, taught them about hygiene, fodder for cows, about medication, and really increased the production. And they're not only working with the very big farmers that can afford 500, 600 cows. They are also working with the smallholders. I spoke with a few female farmers who have just a few cows, who they also train, they also benefit from this. And yes, they are looking into cleaner production of milk, pasteurizing, sterilizing milk, packaging it so that it's nice and clean in the shop. And but there's still a lot of open milk, I think you call it like that, open milk that you just buy on the street, which is available. And yes, I know prices are rising. It's not only for milk, it's for almost every food commodity which is on the market. I am not sure if I understood your question correctly, that now because of their arrival that other people are not having access to milk. But I do not really understand that, because I mean there are still so many small farmers who have milk for their own production. Very many small farmers have milk cows for their own consumption. And Friesland-Campina is just trying to professionalize that and just also make it on a much bigger scale. And I see that it bears fruit.
Now we just have time for one last question, because the organizers are already...
One big issue is Manuville family. Is 23 years ago is 9 family members kidnapped. This time is not released. First time. He is 5 years continue protest in Hyderabad Press Club and Supreme Court so 1 year. And second, and this time our area is higher filled. But our committee is not is help our government, and this time one-man commission, Dr. Shoaib Sadal, is approach this one festival, Diwali Tehwar. So 10 people is only feed.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your thoughts. I have to draw the line here. We're already way over time. Because we gathered here today in honor and memory of our lovely friend, sister, someone that I had the pleasure of knowing for almost 30 years, Asma Jahangir. My concluding thought on Sri Lanka. It was about 50 years ago that I was first introduced to Sri Lanka just by chance. And that was because somebody, one of the elder members of my family, had an eye operation. And the first time that I heard of a Sri Lankan pioneer, Dr. Hudson De Silva, who's really the founding father of the eye bank, the famous eye bank in Sri Lanka, which began exporting corneas and lenses to Pakistan. 50 years later, parts of Pakistan are still grappling with organ donation. This is just one of the many causes that Asma Jahangir talked about, evidence of contradictions within our own country. We also have the problem of polio, whether we ought to vaccine our kids or not. These are just two examples, but I especially bring this up because the Hudson De Silva is an example of Sri Lanka being much more progressive than the case of Pakistan, sadly. And unless we deal with these internal contradictions, we can put as many examples of progressive behavior on the table. We can draw upon generous donors such as the Netherlands and other countries, but unless we fix Pakistan internally, the sad reality is that this country is not going to change. Once again, I have just shared this because we've gathered here for remembering Asma Jahangir. Dr. Atif Mian, it's been such a pleasure, and as I said earlier on, an honor to be sharing this forum with you, given your eminent status as a very accomplished Pakistani economist, and may the Lord give you further success. Members of the panel, thank you very much for being here. It's been a fascinating conversation. I wish we could have gone on for longer, but time is a powerful constraint.